Weather and flights are always fun, but we're here. My name is Skip Rutherford, Dean of the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service, and welcome to another in a series of our programs, discussions, and community conversations. If I might begin tonight by asking you to please turn your cell phones and other electronic equipment off, as it interferes with the speaker system. And while we're doing that, I hope you'll look on your chairs at the upcoming programs that we are having here at the Clinton School. We will soon announce our November schedule, which is going to be terrific. So we're excited about that, and we appreciate you being here tonight. We just completed the Slate 60 conference, and tonight we have an excellent program, one that we're very proud to bring to the Clinton School. To introduce our speaker tonight is a Clinton School student who grew up in Cleveland, Mississippi, a graduate of the University of Southern Mississippi at Hattiesburg with honors. He went on to work with AmeriCorps and with public service programs throughout the world, including Vietnam and in Ecuador. At the Clinton School, he's working on an after-school care task force with the Governor's Commission to assess the needs as well as the assets regarding after-school care for children in Arkansas. Would you please welcome James Mitchell.
Well, I just want to start off by saying how thrilled I am that Alan Keyes has been kind enough to come and speak with us here at the Clinton School. As you all know, we're a school with a partisan name. However, we're a school with a bipartisan mission. The Clinton School of Public Service seeks to train compassionate young leaders to build a better country hand in hand with members from both sides of the aisle. Critical to this mission and to the academic integrity of our institution is a constructive dialogue between both liberals and conservatives. I believe that our public programs truly embody this commitment to providing a platform for the ideas and opinions of all sides, and tonight is certainly no exception. Dr. Alan Keyes, who holds his PhD in government from Harvard, is a dyed-in-the-wool Christian conservative. A Republican political activist, author, and diplomat, Dr. Keyes has a lengthy and distinguished record of public service. His diplomatic work began with the State Department, where he served our country in Zimbabwe and India. Following his stint at the State Department, Dr. Keyes was appointed ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council by then-President Ronald Reagan. Later, he was named Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. Dr. Keyes has also served as a member of the National Security Council, as president of Citizens Against Government Waste, as interim president of Alabama A&M University, and as a member of the American Enterprise Institute, focusing his research on diplomacy and international relations. A consummate Republican politician, Keyes ran in Maryland for the United States Senate in 1988 and again in 1992. In 1996 and in 2000, he went after the Republican presidential nomination, campaigning on a platform of pro-life, pro-family, and tax reform. In 2004, he again ran for the United States Senate, this time in Illinois, losing to Democratic Senator Barack Obama. And as of September of this year, Dr. Keyes has announced his candidacy for the 2008 Republican presidential nomination. Dr. Keyes says that he's here to ask us, is higher education too liberal? I kind of think I know where he stands, but I appreciate that he's here to tell us why. Would you please help me in warmly welcoming to Little Rock and to the Clinton School of Public Service, Dr. Alan Keyes.
Thank you. Good job. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I have to have one slight demurral here because I don't believe, or to put it differently, I do believe with Socrates. You wouldn't call somebody a consummate doctor if every time he operated the patient died. It is required every now and again that you produce a success, otherwise people will start to wonder. So I usually disclaim the notion that I'm a politician. I involve myself in political affairs, but I have probably lost more elections than most people have been involved in. And this hardly qualifies as a consummate record, even though it might be a good one, depending on what you think of the things we stand for. Because one of the things I'll be talking about tonight, as a matter of fact, it may be the epitome of what I'll be talking about tonight, is that we now live in an era where, once again, we confuse ourselves with the notion that success is somehow consonant with rightness and righteousness. And this is a deadly and dangerous idea that will undo everything our country is supposed to stand for, and is in fact doing so. But before I get to that, I have to also start by saying that, as is sometimes my habit, and it's not just because I like being kind of intellectually ornery, I must start out by saying that, contrary to what some folks might think, my answer to the question on tonight's agenda, is higher education in America biased toward liberalism? Is it too liberal? The answer to that question is no. It's not. See, because if rightly understood, I don't believe there's anything liberal at all about the intellectual environment of America. And one of the great problems I've had throughout my lifetime is that this wonderful word, liberal, which has as its root liber, which, as I recall, means free, right? Should be hijacked by folks who, by and large, have abandoned the idea that human freedom is possible and have substituted for it notions that, on the one hand, see our collective life as a life in which, at the end of the day, we must achieve order by means of a totalitarian and controlled environment dominated by government power, and on the other hand, have redefined freedom so that it represents the anarchy of passion that throughout most of human history was identified with enslavement to passion, not freedom. We are caught then between these two monsters, the Scylla and Charybdis, that masquerade under the name of liberalism, having abandoned the very concept of human freedom. Now, why did this happen? And this is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. Now, I could try to go through a whole catalog. Oh, you've got all these liberal professors. They talk about this and that and the other thing, and they're standing against things that I think are right over here and over there. But, you know, the truth of the matter is that you could find conservative professors, too. I know some conservative schools. And I don't think that's the problem, not with our intellectual environment, not with the environment of academia in general. I think the problem is deeper than that. And I think it's a problem that actually results from the success of one major human endeavor, what we call our modern science. See, the scientific approach to the world has been in some ways very successful. We all live in the midst of its wonderful magic in one way or another. And it's been scoring those successes for what, the last couple hundred years at least, in ways that have vastly increased our comfort, our commodious living, our productivity, and so forth and so on, because it represents what appears to be a very effective way of understanding and manipulating the material world. And so it has been highly successful at that. So successful, in fact, that over the course of our intellectual history in the last couple hundred years, more and more effort has been made to pretend that that scientific approach to the material world is the very paradigm, the sine qua non of human knowing. So that the idea of knowledge itself then must conform. If you don't know it scientifically, then you don't know it. That is kind of the assumption we make. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is the nature of the material world as science knows it. And in the nature of the material world, you have the tyranny of cause and effect. The tyranny of that which follows from that which precedes. So that at the end of the day, science is only possible because of a certain kind of materialistic determinism. Now, how many of you think that that kind of determinism is compatible with freedom? Well, it is in one sense. in the Hobbesian sense that, according to science, the river is free, right? Because it flows the way it's supposed to flow. So long as you are moving through space and meet no obstacle, you are free until an obstacle meets, and you are then going to change your vector in a way that is determined by the nature of the obstacle that you meet. So you could redefine freedom to simply mean the ability of this or that, the particle, the thing, to move freely, to act according to whatever impetus or impulse was given by its cause, until something else interferes with it. There's just one little problem with that, of course. That doesn't at all correspond to the way we human beings think of our own freedom. We don't think that we're free when the cause determines our action. When the external thing determines our action, we are neither free nor are we even responsible. So that if at the end of the day I end up killing you because I was overcome by some external force that made me do it, we don't even hold me responsible for your death. Because freedom, in the way that we understand it, is a prerequisite of that responsibility. But it means, freedom as we understand it in that sense, that I had to have chosen the action. Not have the action chosen for me by a cause that I could not control, which then compelled me to react according to a rule that I did not establish in such a way as to produce an outcome that I did not will. When we are caught up in such circumstances, science can certainly understand them, but they do not correspond to our understanding of freedom. Now, you rightly would say, but Alan, that's a subjective understanding of freedom. Yes, it is. But that is, in one respect, the distinctively human thing, isn't it? See? That distinctively human quality is that unlike the stones and the molecules and these other things that science does so well with, we fancy ourselves to have an inner as well as an outer being. So that if I deal with you as if all there is to you is what your body represents to me, its chemicals, its water content, its various assorted ways of reacting to the material environment, then I have dehumanized you. And we would all of us understand that when I treat you in that way, as if you are only a material thing, I am not giving or taking account of your humanity. And this is where we run into the problem that arises from this effort, this desire to act as if the successful scientific paradigm that we have used to know better and manipulate the material world can be applied to human things. And don't tell me we haven't tried to do it, because we have. Now, I went to Harvard. When I was there, it was still called government. I think it still is. But over at Yale, they called it political science. And they weren't using that in the general old way where science just meant something you know. No, they were using it in a way that suggested that somehow or another you could, in fact, make your understanding of science conform to the principles of scientific materialism. And that is true of social science and other sciences. We even tried to pretend that psychology itself, the psyche, the soul, the very thing that throughout most of human history was understood to be the essence of the expression of that immaterial something or other that transcends in us the possibilities of the matter, even that we now believe through behavioral science and other things that we are going to subject to the scientific paradigm. Now that suggests something very disturbing. Because the more you go down that road, the more you make that effort, the more you are moving the human things into the category of the non-human things. The more you move the human things into a realm where freedom in the deliberative sense, in the sense of choice, in the sense of the voluntary, cannot possibly exist. See, and that's why I beg to differ. I don't think that I would call the intellectual environment we operate in liberal. What's it got to do with freedom? When we are trying, on account of success in one area, not necessarily applicable, you see. to apply the principles of a scientific approach to human things. And the only problem with that application is that in order to make it, we must deny the very essence of our humanity. That's interesting, isn't it? It is the place we're caught. And that's because we didn't have the wisdom to remember what Aristotle knew, that we shouldn't look for the same precision in dealing with human things that we look for when we deal with that which is not human. Because of that which cries out in us against this possibility of precision. And what is it that cries out in us? Everything. Everything. The moment I start to treat you as if you are just a thing, you watch how nasty you'll get with me. And it's not just you. It's everybody. Some part of us, even from the time we are wailing imperiously as children, something about us understands that we're important. Our being here has meaning. Stones may be stones and this may be that, but we are something that can't quite be treated in the same way. At least we all think so. Okay? Take a vote amongst the human race. I'm pretty sure everybody would favor you, if not articulately, then in terms of their reaction to your abuse, with the same opinion that whatever it may look like to you, this finite little being here, it is infinitely precious to somebody, starting with the person it represents. Now, how can this be? This is where we encounter that which is the jumping off point for any of those things which ultimately lead us to poetry and to faith. The fact that in each and every one of us somewhere, there coexists this sense that, yes, we are finite, limited beings, determinate in the physical sense, and yet at the same time, we are beings who, touched by the sunset and the twilight and the music and the song and the dance, can feel stirring within us the reality of infinite meaning, infinite possibilities. Things that though they cannot somehow be siphoned through this little being that we are, nonetheless fill us with a longing for that being without limit, which we know ourselves to be. Somewhere in the midst of that tension between what we are as limited, finite, material beings and what we know ourselves to be internally as being standing in the presence of infinite possibility that we somehow realize and yet cannot attain. Somewhere in the midst of that arises our freedom. Right? Our freedom, which we all know to be partly a consequence of our capacity for envisaging those limitless possibilities. For knowing that though we are thus, we could be otherwise. That though we are here, we might be there. That though it has been done this way, it could be done some other way. And yet somehow, even as we sense that infinite plethora of possibilities is for us a reality that constitutes meaning in the world, yet at the same time we know that we would not exist to make the choice, to consider the possibilities, if we were not somehow defined apart from the shapeless and infinite background of being in the context of which we exist. Isn't that fascinating? It is to me. It always has been. But that means that somehow or another, both our humanity and our freedom exist not in this possibility or that, but in the tension between them. In the tension between our finitude and our infinite meaning lies the possibility both of our existence against what would otherwise be the colorless and shapeless background of being itself, and our freedom, our capacity to choose somewhat amongst those things, even amongst those things, by the way, which we cannot be. Because at the end of the day, our sense of the things that we are in relation to the things that we can be or should be or might be, that's what gives rise to our attitude. And no matter what else might be done to our freedom, we all know, don't we, that at the end of the day, it's not going to touch our attitude. We might be in prison, but we'll still have an attitude. We might be in chains, but we'll still have an attitude. We might be limited in every possible way, but we'll still exercise the freedom to curse that darkness which bars us from the light. Something in us knows that though we are finite, we are made for freedom. That though we are finite, we are made for choice. That though we are constrained, we leap in some aspect of our being beyond the possibility of all constraint. See, what I think we find difficult to deal with in our time intellectually is the fact that it is not for us to go this way or that with the terms of that tension. We must live within it. If indeed we are, as some of the philosophers have suggested, like a wound in being, then it is the nature of our life to live with, not to escape that wound. Not to sew it up, because we cannot bring these opposite possibilities together in such a way as to make the wound disappear, nor simply to plunge into its nothingness, for then we would deny our own existence. Okay? Now, why have I gone through all this? Because I think that poses a question for us. And it's a question that we are not going to be free properly to address until we have freed ourselves from the tyranny of the scientific paradigm. Until we have realized once again, fully and completely, that though it's good for what it's good for, it is not good for us. That though it can know some things about the world, maybe even some terribly important things, it must always ultimately come up against something in the knower that it cannot touch, that it cannot conceive, and that it will never understand. And I think that in our sophomoric sort of arrogance as human beings in this era of the first glimmers of scientific success, we've done what sophomores always do. We have mistaken the little knowledge that we have for all knowledge. And we have tried to apply the paradigm of that little knowledge to the one thing that must escape it if we are to remain what we are. Now, that has all kinds of consequences for our creativity and our other things, but it also has some pretty devastating consequences, in my opinion, for our politics and for our society and for our understanding of concepts that must be basic to our relations with one another as human beings. I'll give you an example. Sometime back, you all probably witnessed the controversy that occurred within the mostly, of course, Republican and conservative realm over G.W. Bush's proposed nomination of Harriet Miers to be a judge on the Supreme Court. This was one of those cases when it seemed that there was a certain amount of agreement between conservatives and liberals, all of whom agreed in thinking this was not the greatest idea that he'd come up with. But I think the reason I finally decided that this wasn't such a great idea was when I read of a speech that she had given, if I may, with apologies to her, take her name in vain. I think it was back in 1992. She was speaking to some group in Dallas. And she made the statement that she thought that we should only, in politics, deal with those issues which could be addressed on a scientific basis. And I read that and I said, whoa. We're going to put Harriet Miers on the Supreme Court. And you know the first thing that occurred to me? First thing that occurred to me in that regard was that little statement which is there in the founding principles of our country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Words that have rung down through history in the mouths of some of our greatest agitators for justice, whether it was Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or others. They just thought those words summed it up. They pricked the conscience of America time and time again with that concept of divinely ordained equality, not to be violated by power and wealth and the snide assumptions of racial superiority, but to be respected on account of the authority of the whole as it comes from the hand of Almighty God. And I sat there reading this phrase by Harriet Mize and thinking, well, if all our politics can only address issues that can be dealt with on a scientific basis, what becomes of the issue of justice? That was the impetus for the very foundation of our way of life. Can't be addressed on a scientific basis. And as a matter of fact, I think if you were really to be strictly truthful about it, science would establish that there is no such thing as human equality. And that in just about every way you can think of, human beings differentiate themselves in various hierarchical possibilities according to the material determinism that constitutes the finite being of each person. Some can jump farther and throw better and sing more sweetly and see with greater vision, even think more capably on account of how this primordial ooze has organized itself as a result of what they tell us is the evolutionary process. And even if we think about that process, it turns out that the very essence of the statement it makes about our development contradicts the claim of equality that is forever in our mouths. For evolution is about the priority of the last one standing. It is about the claim of the superior to assert that superiority simply by virtue of outlasting everybody else. And you and I both know that if we applied that as a recipe for justice in human social affairs, we would return to the worst kind of oligarchic, militaristic, barbaric violence. And everybody who was on the losing end of the stick could be expected to be stomped down just as far as was necessary to support the comfort and convenience of those strong enough to do the stomping. Are we prepared to follow this paradigm of scientific understanding into the world that it once again says? It's amazing, though, that in that particular case, our scientific progress would take us several hundred years back into the past, especially from where we sit today as citizens in the United States. And a lot of our favorite pretensions would suddenly go by the board. No more demonstrating for equal rights for this one and that one, because the only way you demonstrate what you should have is by beating the folks who want to keep it from you. We ready to go back to that world? Because that is the world implied by the paradigm of science without regard to the subjective assertion of our meaning, of our worth. But here's the other side of the problem. Here's the other side. What matters to subjective assertion? What possible status could it have? Reminds me of something I can't remember what Montesquieu or Montaigne wrote about the fact that why would you value the opinion of 100 people whose opinion as individuals you have no respect for? So if a vote were taken amongst 100 people you have no respect for, why would the fact that 99 of them voted for something give you any greater respect for it? See? If you can't establish the claim of the individual to represent a standard, then the collective represents no standard. At least not from your point of view. And that is where we fall over into the other stool, you see, because once we start to go down this road, which sounded good to some folks, even Rousseau and folks like this, and you start to look at this subjective claim that we all seem to make, you have to ask a question about why you have to give it any authority. Why should the whining we do in response to how folks want to treat us as if we're instruments, you know? The people who want to enslave you and act as if you're just a biological version of a broom sweeping the house. Biological version of a beast of burden carrying the burdens. Why should they pay any attention to our whining any more than one might pay attention to the whining of the chicken as you wring its neck? You know? Why should this bother you? What that points to is the fact that even though in a scientific sense it is wrong to treat human beings as if they were material objects, yet in another sense, we cannot establish with any sense of soundness or firmness our regard for our subjective claim to meaning unless we can somehow assert that it has an objective basis in reality. And that's a problem. It's the problem we're not dealing with very well in our society, you see. And the reason we're not dealing with it very well is because in order to ascribe to our subjective sense of worth an objective reality, we would have to begin toying with the possibility that there is in being itself an objective authority that determines the worth of that which science cannot understand and yet which we strongly feel. Now, you know what people usually call that, right? What do they usually call that? God! You got it! All of a sudden, we're standing here, and we forget this as Americans. See, I think we forget it all the time. We think, as a lot of people would like us to believe, that it was just some accident of their particular culture that led the founders of this country to include that reference to the Creator God in the Declaration of Independence. I beg to differ with you. They were pretty sophisticated guys, and they included in their midst some thoroughly convinced atheists and other folks who were pretty good at arguing their position. It ought to remind us and suggest to us that maybe the challenge that they were dealing with is a challenge somehow inescapable in our human affairs. The challenge that would allow us somehow or another to escape this problem, the problematic nature of our subjectivity, so that it does not lead in the direction that it leads for us today. Because in consequence of some things that you all are probably altogether too familiar with, fact, value, distinction, all this other stuff the philosophers came up with, we find ourselves bifurcated. Living in a world where over here we've got facts, we can deal with them on an empirical basis, we can understand them, and so forth and so on. And then we can go to human things and we can pretend to reduce them to that kind of objective, factual basis by doing surveys and polls and stuff. Now, of course, when we do our surveys and polls and all this junk, we're begging a question. Why should anybody care what all these people think? The preferences of the masses constitute no particular authority of any kind whatsoever. The norm of human desire and even of human judgment on a subjective basis, if it has no objective claims to reality or authority, means nothing. See, that's what makes most social science and all this junk people do. It's just a lot of pretentious garbage. And when you scratch it a little bit, it turns out that it has no particular significance unless you make certain very questionable assumptions about how we should regard the general trend of human desires and behavior. It's one of those things that you can be cured of if you sit down and read Montaigne a lot. And though I'm not a fan of his purposes necessarily, I always think reading him is a good antidote to the notion that somehow or another human conventions are a guide to very much of anything. Because there's almost no evil possible in the mind and imagining of man on which some society has not agreed to found its sense of justice. And that ought to give us pause about basing our understanding of anything on surveys and polls that indicate this, that, or the other thing. The only reason that such things can be valid is if we have somehow established that the consent that is represented by this or that preponderant trend has a claim to be respected. And in our society, that claim to be respected was not asserted sui generis. It was asserted on the basis of an appeal to the objective authority of God. Now, easily remove God from the equation, and what do you get? Well, you get what we get. You get what masquerades as relativism, but what turns out in point of fact to be the mere anarchy of passion and unbridled will, where at the end of the day, anything goes if you can get away with it. And you and I both know that's the world we're heading into. That's the world we're deeply into. That's the world in which we're already seeing the bodies piling up of the victims of our somehow sterilized but still quite repugnant atrocities. Now, how would we escape this? Well, see, I think there's only one way to escape it, and that means we have to start taking seriously, once again, what our founders took seriously. But the difference between that and where we are is that instead of having a subjective assertion of meaning and worth, we appeal to an authority that at one and the same time sustains our sense of infinite worth, but confirms the finitude of our actual existence, forcing us to live within the tension that we are. Not allowing us to move over here into the totalitarian order of physical nature, nor over here into the anarchy of Nietzschean willfulness in which we devour one another, including ourselves, ultimately, in the orgy of our own unlimited indulgence of will and imagination. No. Forcing us to a certain kind of collective moderation, because we can claim the possibility of freedom only on the basis of an authority that then prescribes the boundaries for its exercise. I sometimes wonder why this is so hard for us to conceive of, when if you think of it in just the starkest terms of being and existence, it's actually what makes the existence of all particular individual beings possible. Right? I mean, at one and the same time, if there were just a whole, the night in which all cows were black, there would be no particular existences. In order for those existences to emerge, to be freed from the background of that indeterminate being, they must have boundaries in terms of that being. They must have form, and they must respect that form, or else lose their existence. It turns out then that their freedom is also a kind of determinate subjection, and that if they deny that determinacy, they lose the freedom. Neither, however, does the determinacy deny them the wholeness that that freedom represents. And that's why in our consciousness of what we are, we have this tension. For we know ourselves to be the whole, even though we see ourselves as only part of it. And in that tension between the whole that we know ourselves to be and the partial thing that nonetheless asserts that wholeness in a particular form, our consciousness finds the possibility of freedom. Now, I think that relates to politics in a very simple way. And in our politics, it's actually more simple than we make it. We claim our rights on the basis of the authority of the whole as represented in our Great Declaration by our evocation of the authority of God. We can keep those rights only insofar as we respect the boundaries that make our evocation of that authority possible. Okay? Or to put it the way I usually put it when I'm giving political speeches, if we claim our rights from the authority of God, we must exercise those rights with respect for the authority on the basis of which we claim them. Discard the authority, we discard the rights. And this is what has always put me in the face of this kind of problem with our common sense these days. And I haven't found anybody who gives any kind of adequate answer to this. Maybe it's just that some of the people who live in our society, they have the princely natures that don't mind the wonderful possibilities of brutality that are opened up by the anarchy of will and passion. They revel in the prospect of that Nietzschean war of all against all, the feud of arrogance in which those not sufficiently strong in their arrogance will be bruised and crushed. Maybe they are happy with that prospect. Having to look back at a heritage in which my people were amongst the folks that were caught in that particular wine press, I don't particularly care for the idea of it. And therefore, I have been kind of attached to the notion that if we have freedom, it must be moderated by a sense of our respect for those boundaries in our use of it that allow each and every individual to emerge in their distinctive possibility and potential with the worth that is ascribed to them, not by our use, but by the objective will of being itself, the objective will of God. Now, is there a liberal bias in academia? Well, no, because what I just described was not liberal. See? I think that because academia tends to worship the paradigm of material science, academia these days is generally illiberal. It abandoned the paradigm of what used to be called liberal education precisely because it was education for life in the tension, for life that recognized the possibilities of choice, even as it accepted the notion that only discipline, in a moral sense, allows one to realize those possibilities. It's sort of like, I think, what you see in great artists and people like this, who at one and the same time can achieve things that when you stand before them or hear them and listen to them, they just open you up, they free you to possibilities that you didn't even know were in you. But when you read their lives, it turns out that they were able to get to the point where they could make that freedom possible only by accepting the severe genius, the severe discipline of their own genius. Okay? When are we as a free people going to understand that we are in the same position? We have been granted, I believe, by Providence, the possibilities of being the maestros of human liberty. But if we mean to fulfill that possibility, then we too will have to accept, as our founders, by the way, explicitly said we must, the discipline of our genius. They referred to that word all the time, the genius of the American people. Okay? And I believe that the temptations of arrogance that are engendered by our science, combined with the wrong understanding of freedom that results from the rejection of the notion that there is such a thing as an objective basis for our subjective worth, though science does not understand it. That is to say that it's possible to deal rationally and objectively with moral challenges. That has led us to these sort of two monsters. Over here, an understanding that leads us down the road to totalitarianism. Over here, an understanding that is fast leading us down the road of unbridled hedonism and selfishness and arrogance and willfulness that must end in the destruction of all decency and all justice. It does not have to be this way. But I think we will only start to wake up to the ways in which we can avoid this grinding ourselves to death between these monsters. We'll only wake up to those possibilities when we start to confront the real challenge of our liberty once again. And to see that challenge as presented to us in some of these issues we don't like to talk about, that we claim should not be part of our politics, but that in fact represent the essence of its possibility. What do we do with the claims of the weakest and most voiceless amongst us, whether they are the poor or the child in the womb? What do we do with the claims of those natural bonds which come to us, not by our own choice, but by the obligations of that which defines our particular existence, the obligations of our nature, represented in things like the family and sexuality and all these things that now we wish to act as if they are subject only to our fiat and our hedonistic impulse? We will have to confront these things. And we will have to do so in a way that seriously understands that we cannot have the freedom we are reaching for except we accept the destruction of freedom that must come when we transcend the boundaries of the tension that defines our human existence. Now, I hope, with apologies, because the last few minutes I haven't been talking like a politician. But what can I do? You know? I always give in to this temptation when I come into an academic environment. I would make one final point, though. We're going to be better off one of these days when we realize that as a nation, we're not going to survive. I think we are, in fact, failing right now. The experiment of liberty our founders launched is sort of coming apart. And one of the reasons is that we have gotten so caught up in the practical particulars of our so-called politics that we are neglecting what was in some ways the deep-seated thoughtfulness that went into its foundations. We have leaders now who cannot even conceive of the true dimensions of these foundations. They stand next to them as tiny little beings, patching up cracks in the wall while the foundation crumbles. And they are pathetic. And they will not be adequate for the survival of this precious gift, which is our liberty. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions. Please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you up front.
Hello, my name is Sanford Johnson. I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and I want to thank you for being here. I have a question for Alan Keyes, the Black Republican candidate. All right. It is true that the nation is becoming more diverse. It is also true that some Democrats do take the black vote for granted. It is true that blacks are very socially conservative, in fact, more so than a lot of other groups. Yet it is also true that African Americans have constantly rejected the Republican Party when it's time to go to the polls. I have two questions for you in regards to that. Why have black Republicans showed little interest in packaging the GOP platform to the black community in regards to, they'll talk about black issues, but they won't say it in the black community, they'll say it at the country club. And also, as a candidate for president this coming cycle, what will you do to change that?
Well, see, I'll get to that. One part of the answer to that question has less to do with the black community than it has to do with the very deep reluctance of not only Republican politicians, but all our politicians, to deal with the moral issues that confront us. And you know, the reason that they don't want to deal with them is what I was just talking about. To deal with those moral issues in a serious way, you have to have an ability, a kind of profoundly digested understanding of the founding principles of this country's life. Most of them haven't spent even 5 minutes of their lives thinking about those principles. And if you listen to their speeches, they don't talk about them anymore because they're kind of embarrassing, you know, to them. Now, how could you, knowing that, one of the great grounds of appeal, if you were going to be a Republican going forward in the black community, you would want to go into the black community and talk about the very things that are supposed to be so important to Republican moral conservatives, right? How we defend marriage and pro-life and all of these sort of things. They don't want to talk about it. Well, I won't even put it that way. It's not that they don't want to talk about these things, it's that they can't. As I think I was just demonstrating, it would be possible, in my opinion, it is possible, because I've done it, to go before black audiences and show a profoundly important connection between certain moral principles, certain stands on issues, morally based, and the very appeals that were made by Martin Luther King and all the folks who fought for black greater justice for black people and so forth. It's part of the warp and woof and fabric of the black community. And it also, of course, resonates with what is the community of faith that transcends the boundaries of party. Republicans aren't interested in reconstituting that community of faith, partly because they don't know how to deal with the issues. They talk about them all the time, but they talk about them in a way that totally neglects their connection with the principles of American life. It's all shallow and inadequate. So either it's an assertion of personal faith, right? Or it's just a matter of opinionated kind of pounding of the podium. It never occurs to them that this isn't a debate over our personal faiths. It's a debate over our national creed. and whether we any longer take it seriously. It's exactly the same kind of debate that was required during the civil rights movement and so forth. So I think that that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is more practical and sad. And that is that, how can I put this delicately? I don't know why I care to put it delicately anymore. Shouldn't. I don't think a lot of the Republicans really give 2 cents for the black community. I was feeling that way when I went to the Maryland Public Television debate, and none of the so-called big names showed up. Part of me, sad to say, sees this as, playing Peter against Paul, because they kind of figured they can go after the Hispanic community in some other way, and that's going to offset this or that, and they tried that strategy for a while. Here's my answer to the overall problem. I think it might be useful if all these people would remember that somewhere in the midst of all of this, whether we're black or white or this or that or the other thing, there is a part of us that still remembers that there's something special about being American. And that something special isn't the same thing as being French or being German, that we define ourselves in terms of some narrow national particularity. No. It's because in reaching for that American thing, we are actually hoping to find our common humanity. And when we do, we rejoice. And I think that the black community would respond to that appeal just like every other. And that in point of fact, the heritage of black people, speaking as it must to some of the greatest challenges to the American soul that ever existed, that is the very context in which to make the appeal to the American heart in a special way. But my Republican colleagues don't understand this, and they apparently never will.
You had a question in the back?
Alan Keyes, I've listened to you for years and tried to buy into the moral and the founding fathers. But let me say this. Do you think there's any time in American history, even from the beginning, that the tension that you're talking about, that it was ever less tension, where it was almost level? Because it seems like the focus is going more to the unbridled. I mean, it's like the people of color versus the whites.
Well, no, I don't think there was ever a time in our history when this sort of tension that can never be resolved but can sort of be moderated was ever absent. I mean, let's consider what I believe to be the true explanation of, say, slavery. A lot of people like to talk about slavery as if it was about race. No, slavery was about unbridled greed. That's what slavery was about. It was about an unbridled passion that then led people, for the sake of satisfying that passion and the way of life they built upon it, totally to disregard the claims of humanity of other human beings. When we understand it in those terms, we can see that it is, in fact, an expression of the anarchy of passion. And in some ways, by the way, was explicitly asserted as such. When you read John C. Calhoun and these people talking about the principles they kind of, sometimes quite explicitly, rejected the Declaration, rejected the idea that all men are created equal, rejected that appeal to God, and instead appealed to the divine more in the sense that people had done it throughout human history. Because you do have to remember, don't we? We do have to remember that God has had many uses, sad to say, in the minds of those who think he can be used. And one of his many uses was to keep people in subjection. I rule over you because God made it this way. And how do I prove that God made it this way? Every time I stomp your butt on the battlefield. That's how. Right? And that was how human beings went about their business. And I think to a certain extent, though they dressed it up in fancier language, the advocates of that peculiar institution at the South appealed to these kinds of old-style notions of the divine order of things, which sotto voce sort of resembles the natural order of things according to our science. But we won't go there, even though we should. So I think the tension was always there. Now, here's where I would try to address what I think was underlying the question. The reason that I have, throughout my political career, put such an emphasis on the Declaration of Independence is because for that one moment, by whatever providence of God and the openness of some human hearts, there were people who actually articulated the truth by which their anarchic passions and all the injustice that resulted from them would be condemned. I think those are precious moments. When human beings are actually honest about the standards that reprove the nasty behavior from which they benefit. We ought to make sure people don't forget those moments. They don't happen that often in human history, you know. And by whatever grace of God and the founders, and I know there are people who don't like to talk about them, dead white males, and they had slaves and all of this. Look, is there any generation, including our own, that isn't perpetrating some gross evil against innocent humanity? I'm sorry. It is not unusual in any generation for the gross evil to be perpetrated. What is unusual is for the principle that condemns it to be enshrined as the national principle of a country. Well, I think we do humanity a great service if we can keep that moment alive. Because as we should be noticing in our own time, there's need for that reproof in every generation. There's need for the powerful and the wealthy and the arrogant and the knowledgeable, those who can collect in their hands the strings with which they can manipulate and subdue humanity. They need to be reminded that their power does not constitute justice, that their victory does not constitute right. And for that brief moment in our history, a principle was enunciated in the light of which you can do just that. And I would suggest we remember it, and every time it's needed, we make creative use of it to encourage people to stand against that which violates their humanity.
Right in the middle. 1, 2 over.
Dr. Keyes, thanks for coming back to Little Rock. Always enjoy hearing you.
Thank you.
So then, what is the place of the principle of separation of church and state that has risen to take on a weight of first principles that perhaps it didn't have in our origins? What should be the place of the separation of church and state in our society now?
Well, I'm so tempted to be flippant with that question, but I won't. And when I say flippant, I mean I could just say none, but that's not entirely true. First of all, though, I have to make something clear, which I think is just objectively a fact. The notion that our Constitution requires the separation of church and state is a lie, okay? Separation of church and state may or may not be, in some ways, a concept that we have to think through, understand, and apply. I don't know. But there's nothing in the Constitution of the United States that requires it, and every suggestion that has been made that it does just requires that we don't know how to read. Because there's nothing there that could be construed in that way. And what they generally use, the Establishment Clause, has nothing to do with separation. It's a federalism issue, not a separation issue. All the Establishment Clause does is forbid the federal government to deal with the issue of religious establishment. Makes me wonder sometimes how these judges got their hands on it. How did the federal judges get their hands on the issue of establishment? Here in the Constitution, the only thing it says is that there can be no law on this subject, right? And then they would certainly be able, if the federal government passed some law on the subject, they'd be able to say, well, no, that can't be because we don't have the authority to do that under our Constitution. So if you don't have the authority to do it, and if the Ninth Amendment says that all those powers not delegated, all those powers not delegated by the Constitution to the United States nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or the people. And there you have a power, the power to deal with the issue of religious establishment in law. And that power is withheld from the federal government. Nowhere in the Constitution does anything prohibit it to the states, and therefore it is reserved to the states and to the people. There's no way to get around this logic, and every time I put it out there, all I get is embarrassed silence, because there's no way to get around it. And the 14th Amendment argument doesn't get around it, because the 14th Amendment simply says that those things which are guaranteed by the first 10 amendments are to be respected by all the states, but one of the things guaranteed is immunity from federal interference on the issue of religious establishment. That's all the 14th Amendment would do. So everything else is a lie. It's a vicious lie, actually. Now, point number 2. whatever the separation of church and state might mean, and I think it does mean something, it certainly can't mean that we can't respect the authority of God in our politics. Now, let me see here. I know that, there's that guy over in England arguing that folks like myself don't have high IQs and stuff, but so it could be that I'm just blighted by nature not to be able to understand these complicated things. But if, as a people, we claim our rights based on the authority of the Creator God, and therefore have a free politics with elections, have a judicial system with due process, and all of that because every individual is endowed with unalienable rights, has a kernel of worth that depends not on the Constitution or human authority, but on the transcendent authority of God Almighty. If that's the whole basis for the existence of our politics and freedom, will somebody explain to me how we can sustain our politics without some respect for it? How we can deal with issues in such a way as simply to disregard it, as we are doing, by the way? So that we will go down a road in which step by step we deny both the existence and the authority of the Creator. Do you know the problem? It's like the one Rousseau mentions in one of his books where he talks about the fellow who sells his bed in the morning forgetting that he's got to sleep on it in the evening. And here we go, giving up the authority that is the source of our rights, forgetting that one of these days when somebody's stomping on our neck, we might just want to encourage ourselves with the notion that however strong they appear at the moment, God is on our side. And you and I both know, don't we remember this? Have we forgotten the lesson of history? That it's very easy to cow human beings once you put the shackles on their minds. Once they get the idea they got to stand in front of you like this, and that they can't look you in the eye, that they can't look at the weapons you use because they belong to the superior ones and so on. You can stomp all over a lot of people, even if you're just a few. But once they get the notion that somewhere inside of them there is that which is allied to the power of the universe itself, they find the courage to face injustice, to confront death, to go onto battlefields that in the past they might have fled, and to stand and to stand and to stand again until they win the victory that justice requires. Do we remember this or not? That which encourages the mass of humanity to stand on its dignity has been critically important to the advancement of freedom. And so I wouldn't want to suggest, if separation means we banish God, as a free people, we got to be really suspicious. We have a bunch of elites in this country encouraging us to give up the idea that God plays any role in justice. Now, isn't it a coincidence that the human race went through thousands of years, and these elites got away with the idea that the gods or God determines justice, establishes, so long as it was their right that was being established. We get this brief little interlude where the mass of the people are appealing to God for their liberty, and now we're told he doesn't exist. Doesn't make you a little suspicious? Makes me a little suspicious. Now, I realize that requires that we take a little longer perspective than we usually do. We look at history in its broad sweep and maybe suggest, as our founders did, that not everything that happens is just an accident. Hamilton gave a long speech at the Constitutional Convention reminding people that princes, what he called the princely types, they exist in every generation. Who are the princely types? The types who like ruling and lording it over other people. In our day, I think they become sort of entrepreneurs, business magnates, rock stars. They like the feelings of power that come from the adulation of the masses said to be inferior to themselves. They are not content with leading the ordinary and commodious lives with which most human beings would be content if they were just left alone. I have nothing against the princes. Well, I may have something in common with them, who knows? But I do have something against the pretension that they have the right to lord it over societies at the expense of human decency, and I think that reminding the mass of the people that God is on their side doesn't hurt a bit. And so we shouldn't give it up. See? Now, final point. Separation of church and state must have a meaning, though, in one respect, because it must be like one of those one-way gates in electronics, right, where the force flows in one direction and not in the other. So that the respect for the sovereignty of God as it flows from the people through their representatives into law and government, that's okay. If it flows back in the form of government power to coerce the conscience of the people as individuals or as a whole, then it is forbidden. But the Constitution takes care of that in the clause after the Establishment Clause, which does bind everybody. And that is that government cannot interfere with the free exercise of religion. It is no coincidence, by the way, that in our time, as we banish God, we are also watching the development of laws that do just that begin once again to dictate religious conscience, to tell us what is sin and what is not, and force us to accept the result. Okay? We are moving away from what I think was the paradigm of moderation that preserved the tension that was required. Yes, God is needed, but no, you can't force him on anybody. Yes, the people can reverence God, but not in ways that coerce human conscience. Why can't we get this right? It's not that hard to see this combination. It's not that hard to make it work. We did for quite a while. And I think we could again if we would once again take seriously what is true about most of us. That in spite of all this argument and all these books people write and stuff, somewhere in our heart of hearts we have two realities. We still believe in God, and we still think we're going to answer to him someday, most of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Ambassador Alan Keyes. Pastor Keyes can be here for a few minutes. I know several of you had questions. Feel free to come say hello to him. Thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoy our programs.